30 minutes of wonderful music. So if you'd like to get some refreshments, find your seat and sit down. They'll start the music in about 5 minutes.
No matter how obvious and how many times I've seen it, says I just don't want to.
Thank you for the invitation to be here. It is an honor to accompany you in this tribute to Monsignor Romero.
And we got for you tonight is 4 songs dedicated to Monsignor or El Santo Romero.
Yeah, is that okay?
Por esta tierra de hambre, yo vi pasar a un granjero, humilde, manso y sincero, valientemente profeta, que se enfrentó a los tiranos para acusarles del crimen de asesinar a su hermano, a defender a los ricos. Podrán matar al profeta, pero su voz de justicia no, y le pondrán en silencio, pero la historia no callará, y le pondrán en silencio, pero la historia no callará. Con su evangelio en la mano, Monseñor Romero dijo, hacer justicia él la hizo, pero no justo al tirano, porque su voz fue de aliento que defendió al campesino, iluminando el camino, la libertad de este pueblo. Podrán matar al profeta, pero su voz de justicia no, y le pondrán en silencio, pero la historia no callará, y le pondrán en silencio, pero la historia no callará. Su muerte no es coincidencia, deben temblar los tiranos, son ellos los que en sus manos llevan la mancha de sangre, y toda la oligarquía, por ver de tanta demencia, han firmado su sentencia, comienza ya su agonía. Podrán matar al profeta, pero su voz de justicia no, y le pondrán en silencio, pero la historia no callará, y le pondrán en silencio, pero la historia no callará. cumbia a Monseñor Romero.
Ahora vemos, Señor, hoy es el tambor Romero. Ahora vemos, Señor, hoy es el tambor Romero. Y desde el lugar tan santo acompañas al obrero. Y desde el lugar tan santo acompañas al obrero. El diablo se equivocó, como siempre se equivoca. El diablo se equivocó, como siempre se equivoca. A querer callar la boca del hombre que se dio entero, porque él vive con nosotros, ganando por Romero. Ahora el Santo Romero va iluminando el camino. Ahora el Santo Romero va iluminando el camino. Por eso lucha más fuerte el hermano campesino. Por eso lucha más fuerte el hermano campesino. Ahora vemos, Señor, hoy es el Santo Romero. Ahora vemos, Señor, hoy es el Santo Romero. Y desde el lugar tan santo acompañas al obrero. Y desde el lugar tan santo acompañas al obrero. Oigan lo que estoy diciendo, pónganle mucha atención. Oigan lo que estoy diciendo, pónganle mucha atención. Que no te vayamos nunca a lograr la liberación. Que no te vayamos nunca a lograr la liberación. El 24 de marzo salió una mano asesina. El 24 de marzo salió una mano asesina. Y de una forma cobarde por un sueldo quitó una vida. Y de una forma cobarde por un sueldo quitó una vida. Ahora vemos, Señor, hoy es el Santo Romero. Ahora vemos, Señor, hoy es el Santo Romero. Y desde el lugar tan santo acompañas al obrero. Y desde el lugar tan santo acompañas al obrero. Ahora vemos, Señor, hoy es el Santo Romero. Ahora vemos, Señor, hoy es el Santo Romero. Y desde el lugar tan santo acompañas al obrero. Y desde el lugar tan santo acompañas al obrero.
very special event this evening. And before we commence, I'd like to ask you to join me in quiet reflection about the generosity of the Algonquin Coast Salish people in offering us a home and a place to be on their land. Before I start, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the background of tonight's event and to express some other thanks to not only to the people of the Coast Salish people and the wonderful musicians we have, but some of the people who participated tonight. A few months ago I was in Vancouver and I saw an exhibition of photos and films of social actions that went right back to 1914 when the Komagata Maru ship came into the Vancouver harbor and helped change the reaction to that sending back of people to India, helped change our immigration policies. And this photo exhibition went right up to contemporary time, over 100 years of action in Vancouver, to what's going on now with the Kinder Morgan, protecting our land and water from the pipeline. And many people here have friends and relatives, and many people in this room have actually been to the ongoing demonstrations of protection that are happening in Burnaby Mountain. But what this exhibition didn't show was the organizing and the work and the hours of thought and planning that went into all those actions. That there is a great deal that goes into organizing any kind of an event, as went into the event tonight. The South Africans say that it takes a village to raise a child, and I believe it takes a village to put on an event like tonight. So I'd like to name some of the people who have made tonight's event possible for all of us. First of all, I'd like to thank the Fernwood Community Association, because Cafe Simpatico, which is a regular event of the Central America Support Committee, has been meeting in this space for over 30 years. And many thanks to the FCA for their cooperation. I'd also like to thank Nancy Stewart, who is at the door. She helped organize the speaker tonight, and she also has donated a book called A Shepherd's Diary from Oscar Romero. And anybody who didn't get a chance to put a ticket in for the draw is most welcome to do so after the talk, and she will draw the winner then. And the consolation prizes is that we have some very beautiful bookmarks with Oscar Romero on them. So you won't go away empty-handed. And I'd like to thank all the people who helped. Susan, who does the refreshments so beautifully. Corey, who always helps organizing and is our liaison with the Fernwood Community Association. Her husband, Alan, is at the back. Alan is in charge of selling our fair trade organic coffee from Nicaragua. You can pick some up later. It's $13 a pound, and it's just been roasted. It's beautiful coffee. I'd like to thank Eric for helping with the photography, Kevin for setting up the sound system, Peter for organizing our musicians, Kai, who's going to be organizing our next month's Cafe Simpatico on April the 27th, which is about the current situation in Honduras. Kai, where are you? He was here?
Yep.
There he is. And if you want to learn more about Honduras and what we'll be doing, but it's the same time, the same place, on Friday, April the 27th, next month, on Honduras. And did I leave anybody out? I'd like to mention that last year, we had a speaker on this occasion, and it was the author of a book on Oscar Romero called Death of a Saint, which turns out to be very prophetic in itself. And Matt Eisenbrat has brought some of his books with him tonight. He's also at the back with the coffee there. There he is, Matt.
Hi there.
And he has copies of his book, and he's happy to sign them for you. It's a fascinating book, and his talk last year was very fascinating. And I'd like to thank Nancy, who does our Facebook page, Nancy Mack, Glennis, who does our website, and tonight I'd like to thank Efren, who's doing the videography for us. I don't think I've left anybody out, but that's our Village of Help tonight, and thank you all very much.
You left out yourself, you're carried.
Tonight we are honoring the legacy and the life of Oscar Romero, who was assassinated in 1980 on March the 24th, as he gave Mass in a church in San Salvador. Oscar Romero said many wise things in his life, and I wanted to bring some of those quotes with me, so when you have time, you're welcome to come up and read some of those quotes. But one of the most famous quotes of Oscar Romero is that if they kill me, I will be resurrected in the people of El Salvador. In my many travels through El Salvador, I went to many villages, to many towns, and in every place I went, there is a mural of a picture of Oscar Romero and one of his famous quotes, usually that one. There's a picture here that when you come and look at the quotes, there's a picture of a mural. And I took that photograph in a village called San Isidro. And it was on the wall of the home of two people who had been beaten and left for dead that had survived. 3 people had not survived and been assassinated in that village. And their reason was that they were protecting their land and their water from the contamination that would be caused by a gold mine operated, they hoped, by a company called Pacific Rim, which was stationed in Vancouver, based in Vancouver. Last year, the Congress of the government of El Salvador voted to ban metal mining in El Salvador. And which is just absolutely wonderful. And in the meantime, Pacific Rim had launched a lawsuit in a trade tribunal against the government of El Salvador, claiming $300 million US in deemed loss of profit. They lost that case. And I like to think that the people who struggled in El Salvador for justice for their people were the resurrection of the life of Oscar Romero as they worked for these things so successfully. And it's quite wonderful to think that El Salvador is the first country in the world to ban metal mining and to protect its rivers from any further pollution from the effluent and the tailings of mines, which we haven't done in British Columbia, and as you know, we've had many major accidents here. So Oscar Romero lives on in the spirit and the lives and the actions of people of El Salvador. Tonight's guest speaker, we're very privileged to have, we all know has many of the same values of peace and social justice as Oscar Romero. I first met Remy DeRue many years ago when I was on a panel on the People's Inquiry into the Canadian Forces base in Nanu's, and he very ably chaired that panel. That was just one of his many social actions over the years. One particular thing that Remy DeRue did that perhaps many of us don't know, and I feel is very worth remembering today, is in his commitment to social justice and liberation theology, he was the main force behind the 1983 Canadian Bishop's Statement, Ethical Reflections on the Economic Crisis. The document stated that the goal of serving human needs of all people in our society must take precedence over the maximization of profits and growth. That is as relevant today and as important to us today as it was in 1983. Remy DeRue also knew Oscar Romero, and we're honored to have him speak on the prophetic legacy of Oscar Romero. Please welcome.
Good evening. As you've already surmised, I had the privilege of getting to know Oscar Romero. The one occasion when I met him in his home, this is in February of the year 80. He had just returned from a tour of Europe, which had included University of Louvain in Belgium, where he was given an honorary doctorate, and a visit to the Vatican, where he was not that well received. You can imagine for a loyal Roman Catholic bishop to be treated as someone who's dangerous is quite offensive and painful. It's understandable under the circumstances. We were still going through that era where the best way to get rid of somebody was to call them communist. And a lot of that happened. I saw it happen in Guatemala, where ordinary people who happened to be carrying their Bible on their way to a gathering where they would be studying their faith were shot and killed, supposedly because they were communists. Anyway, I don't want to drift in that direction because we have relatively short time this evening. And I do want to share with you some significant points which I think are very important, particularly now, because this is a very special anniversary, very special occasion, because we've just learned that Pope Francis, God bless him, Pope Francis removed the obstacles that had blocked the path of Oscar Romero to his declaration sainthood. For those of you who are not familiar with the Roman Catholic process that is referred to as canonization, it's the equivalent of putting someone in the Hall of Fame. I want to touch on 6 points, and because my memory occasionally begins to fail me, I want to mention them now so I don't forget them before I get to the end of this relatively short presentation. My words tonight are focused in two directions. First, towards the past, looking at the past, and then, secondly, looking into the future. And I'll make these points as shortly as I can now. The first point is to remind ourselves that before all this happened, Oscar Romero was considered a safe bishop. He was known to be a very quiet person, had never caused anything up. That's why when the large archdiocese of Salvador was open and had to be replaced, they picked the bishop of a quiet, tiny little diocese on the outskirts of the city, thinking that everything would roll very smoothly from here on. The point is, they didn't realize that Oscar Romero had been listening very carefully to the voices of the people. And what turned the tables completely in terms of Oscar Romero's attitude was the massacre of a very dear friend of his, Father Rutilio Grande. He wasn't the only one, but he was particularly close to Romero. And I guess that broke his heart. And in so doing, he moved into a different perception of what was really happening. As a result, he got people like Jan Sobrino, with whom I had the privilege of discussing for an hour and a half what was happening in Latin America. Jan Sobrino was still as a resounding, exceptionally gifted theologian. He became the speechwriter, if you will, for Oscar Romero, because Oscar Romero, obviously, in that country in turbulence and the church going through a lot of unrest, had many other things to do besides prepare the talks that he gave. He began on radio at every Eucharistic celebration to tell the people via the radio what was actually happening in their own country, and in that way to denounce what was happening there. And if I have time, I'll touch on that later. The great scripture scholar Brueggemann invented the expression by these words, prophetic mourning. I'll come back to that if I have time. His talks were so incisive and so precise that they began to draw international attention. And the locals, of course, tried to get rid of him. They bombed his radio station on a number of occasions. He was telling me about that when I visited with him. But he persisted. And before long, Oscar Romero became the voice of the voiceless. But I don't want to stay in the past. I want also to look from the present celebration into the future and make a few suggestions for all of you here present in terms of your own attitude when faced with a situation like this of Oscar Romero, where the church recognizes that social justice is an integral part of the message of revelation of the scriptures, and what that means, the consequences it has. At the Second Vatican Council that I had the privilege of attending between 1962 to 65, 4 years, all the Roman Catholic bishops of the world came together, at least those who could come. There were a few from places like China and elsewhere who were prevented from coming. But they were there, so you might say that the formal official leadership of the whole church worldwide was there. First time in history that so many have participated, because previous councils, which happened, as you know, only once about every 100 years, in all I think we had just a little over 21 councils, depending which ones you consider as ecumenical. They were an opportunity to bring up to date our perception of revelation and what that means and what that calls us to do. On that occasion, we basically repaired a breach that had been established pretty deeply in the Catholic Church between us and the Protestant believers in Christ Jesus by giving back what Luther had claimed was their privilege, and it was giving back the scriptures to the laity by allowing the use of the Bible in the vernacular as well as sermons in church. That may appear like taken for granted today, but in those days it was a hard-fought battle because most of the bishops were convinced that Latin was the only sacred language and that everything had to be in Latin. I remember myself listening to my lectures as a seminarian, all in Latin. And at the Vatican Council we used Latin, and there it had a little more sense because, after all, with so many languages, you have to find one that can be common and that a lot of people would know. And most bishops didn't really want to go to Italian. So we did the best we could in Latin. That giving back of the scriptures to all the believers by allowing the use of the vernacular had tremendous consequences, because it meant that even illiterate people who knew the stories of the Bible could come to see that God is always on the side of the poor, on the side of the weak, on the side of the marginalized. And that consequently they reclaimed, as it were, their dignity in the church and their rights. The other point also, maybe less noticeable today, but very real, was the giving back to the laity of the cup. Not the chalice, incidentally, because the cup is a biblical expression that goes much deeper than just receiving under both species. Jesus, when disciples came to him, asked them the question, "Are you prepared the cup that I must drink?" And in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus said, "Father, if it is possible, may this cup pass far from me." So you see, the cup has a very, very symbolic power. The other question also, and the other symbol that arises now, and keep that in mind as we look to the future. I'm going to make a few suggestions. As we look into the future, is the fact that Romero was shot, was massacred, assassinated, during the celebration of the Eucharist, just after he had finished preaching and was moving into what we call the canon of the Mass. That helps us understand a little bit the depth and the power of the Eucharist. The Eucharist is not only something we receive at the celebration where the priest pronounces the words of the power of the Holy Spirit transforming the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. But it's also, Eucharist is a way of life. Eucharist also means giving thanks to God, and Eucharist means the gifts of one's life. If I come forward at a Eucharistic celebration and I receive the cup, I'm also willing to say that I'm prepared to drink this cup, not only here from the cup at the Eucharist, but the cup of life that brings its pain, its sorrow, and its difficulties. It was here that Oscar Romero went through a very profound conversion and became the ardent apostle that we now know about and talk about. As we look into the future, I invite all of you to take an opportunity now, for those who follow the Lenten practices in the liturgy. This is a very good time to do so. We're on the verge of reaching Holy Week and of Easter. A good time to ask ourselves if we are willing to look at the example of Romero. Are we willing ourselves to drink the cup as he did? To shed, if need be, our very life in the service of the Lord. As you've already learned, only recently, Pope Francis has set aside the obstacles that had prevented the bringing forward of the cause on the way to canonization, to putting Oscar Romero in the Hall of Fame. Now, the question then is to ask myself, do I really believe that the pursuit of social justice is part of my mission as a Christian? I know when I was a boy, a young priest, because it didn't happen earlier, young priest, through my seminary, and even first years in ordained priesthood, that for most people, parishioners, members of the parish, who participated in the struggle for the bringing about of social justice, were considered as kind of special people, you might say. And sometimes were actually marginalized because a lot of ordinary people listening to the traditional presentation of our religion would see talk about justice and peace and liberation and theology especially, as a thinly veiled form of what was then called socialism, meaning really communism, or more fully Marxism. All these became, as it were, slogans whereby people basically discouraged the other members of the parish of getting involved in, quotes, politics in that kind of sense. The fact that Romero will now move forward into canonization is a clear indication that the Church has officially recognized that action on behalf of justice and proclamation of evangelization, transformation of society for the better, are actually at the heart of the biblical message, or at the very heart of Revelation. That's one question I'd like you to keep in mind. Is the struggle for justice something optional, or is it integral to our own faith? My second question comes from a song that we've heard. Can we turn our tears into dancing? Because ultimately, what we're doing here, and it's not a question of numbers, but of determination, is to bring hope to the world. I learned a very profound lesson. I was on a fact-finding tour of Latin America, and I was meeting privately with a little group of peasants who had come from the neighboring countries after having collected hands full of beans and corn to ship all this to people who were trying to support the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Here again, the Church for quite some time considered them as not authentic Christians. Even Pope John Paul II fell into that trap, you may recall, when he scolded one of the ministers of the government, because he had been, I think, unduly influenced by his experience in Poland, where everything was black and white. You were a Christian or you were a communist. Obviously, we know that history is more complicated than that, but that caused an enormous amount of pain to an awful lot of people. So I was chatting with these peasants, and in my well-meaning, but no doubt somewhat paternalistic, unconsciously paternalistic attitude, I asked them the following question: what can I do for you? I thought that was a normal question. I meant well. There's a moment of silence, and then one of the peasants said to me in a quiet voice, just matter of fact, go home. And send us proof from your beautiful country of Canada that there is really hope, that your so-called democracy really serves the cause of the poor. And then, when you embrace the cause of the poor, and we hear that good news, then for us, there really will be hope. I leave that with you as another reflection and a question you might want to discuss among yourselves, or in which you might want to engage other people. I want to end by congratulating each and every one of you who are here tonight, and asking you to make sure that a lot of other people come to these events, so they come to understand that biblical injunction whereby we have been told that we must promote justice if we want to claim the discipleship of Christ, or even for those who are not members of any specific religious group, but who are here because you are dedicated to truth and justice and peace. To all of you, I suggest keep on doing what you're doing. As long as there are little groups like this celebrating people like Romero, then there will be hope. So keep up the good work.
Remy has said that he will take questions and discussion, but before that, I would like to thank him very much. I heard Remy speak last year in Nanaimo, he's speaking again at the celebration of Oscar Romero in Nanaimo this coming Sunday as well. We're going to pass the baskets around and ask you for your very generous donations, not only to continue the work of Cafe Simpatico, bringing speakers, films, and events to this place and the expenses involved, but because we also act in solidarity with our partners in Latin America, doing many things that we are asked to help with, from earthquake relief to supporting workers on strike, to supporting art projects, to supporting projects that work against pollution, literacy projects, and many more things that we have done over the last 30 years. And we do that with your donations because we're a volunteer organization, we have no paid employees, and we don't accept any money from governments or corporations. So we're totally dependent on the generosity and the commitment to social justice that our supporters show. So as the baskets go around, I hope you will support us as generously as you can. And if you would like to, after the meeting, buy some coffee and buy the books, we will continue on then. And after we take some questions and discussion, we will have one final song. But perhaps before we do that, Nancy, you come up and draw the winner of the door prize. I read the stories of Oscar Romero. So there we go. You're going to pull. Okay, I hope I don't pull my own. That would be a conflict. I know that's a the lucky number is 879 for every special. 4283. 4283. And there are some very beautiful Oscar Romero bookmarks on the table where the book was, and you're most welcome to take a bookmark when you go. And we'll be, the other thing that the Central America Support Committee needs is workers with ideas and energy, and we will do this by asking you to sign up on our EVOS list, which notifies you of events that we have. And if you're interested in being further involved in the Central America Support Committee, please talk to Corey. Corey's standing up, so stand up again. And Corey or Susan or me or Kevin about participating more actively in Central America Support Committee. We need some new energy and new ideas, and you'll be very welcome. So if you're not on our EWAS notification list, please sign up now. And so we will perhaps ask Remy to come back up and answer a few questions or engage in discussion if that's possible. Thanks, Remy. So does anybody have a question or comment they would like to make? Who's first? Okay, stand up and speak up.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to hear you. It's just amazing. Thank you very, very much for being here. I made several films with priests of the liberation of theology in Central America, in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and actually in Chile as well. And it was very, very sad when the Polish Pope suddenly said, you're not doing any good. And they actually all remained silent for many years. And my question is, do you think now that that movement is returning? Can we see that returning, do you think, in Central America and Latin America?
Thank you for a very good question. Let me begin, first of all, by saying, in my perception, it's not a question of returning it. Liberation theology never left.
Right.
Let me quote Father John Sobrino, who spent an hour and a half initiating me into what was happening in Latin America, which profoundly changed my perception too, and for which I'm eternally grateful. He talked about the role of the peasants throughout the world. Peasants don't only exist in just one country. There are peasants in every country, the marginalized people who frequently are the ones who are building our society, doing all the hard work, but not reaping their share of the profits. He said this: the peasants have never forgotten the lessons of history. They know that every revolution has been fought in their blood. So, he said, their approach now is to move 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but they're moving. There's no question about it. And I think we're going to see more and more an explosion of the peasant movement now that, thanks to intelligent telephones and television and radio, and the fact that everybody now with the smartphones has access to what's happening. They will be reading history from a much closer perception. And I think that their pace of moving forward is going to accelerate. In fact, I see signs of that happening. It has different names in different countries, but it's all the same. So let me remind you that those people who initially criticized liberation theology, first of all, hadn't properly read their Bible and were very faulty even in their theology. The resistance to liberation theology was in itself an ideology. It wasn't a rational movement. It was based on a lot of fear, particularly on the part of the powerful and the rich, and it's had its reflection and repercussions even in the church. Liberation theology, by whatever name it goes, and we have a version of it in practically every major country, including Canada, is basically the struggle for justice. But it's a struggle for justice that finds its roots in the Bible, in tradition. So as long as there's liberation theology around by whatever name, and as long as there are people who are brave enough to identify themselves and move forward, and that's where the challenge comes to all of you, then liberation theology is not stopping. It's moving.
Yes.
Did you want to say anything about Deirdre Kelly? Like, she's a great member of this group, and she worked for you for years.
Well, then Deirdre Kelly, obviously, she wasn't massacred, not with any guns, but she took her share of blows.
That's right.
From different sources, and her share of misunderstanding. But I think she's an exceptional example of a person dedicated to the cause of justice. And for those of you who may not have known her, I suggest that one of the first things you should do is find out who she was and what she did for us, for our church here, nationally, and even to some extent internationally. I think it's going to take a little bit of time for us to catch up with her. But she certainly is a sterling example of the kind of people that have brought more justice and truth to our society. And for that we owe her an eternal debt of gratitude.
And we miss her very much. There are some newspapers on the table, the Island Catholic News, and there's a beautiful photograph of Deirdre on the cover. And we had a celebration and discussion about her at our last cafe, and I'm really pleased that she was brought up again, because we will not forget Deidre. Are there
There's
any?
another hand. There's another hand.
One there, okay.
Thank you for your passion and your insight. Do you have any clue as to what made Oscar Romero tick? Was it his upbringing, his family, his education? What singled him out to make him such a hero for social justice? Thank you.
His education would not have singled him out. He certainly had higher education. He came from a fairly wealthy background. And he was, by nature, a very quiet, not the kind of disturbing person. But I think what really was the straw, if you will, that broke the camel's back, or the final thing that finally switched him, was the murder of his very dear friend, Rutilio Grande. The reason being that while he might have seen other people who got shot, and obviously this in itself is evil, but who got shot, you might say, in unclear circumstances. Now, there's always a little bit of politics mingled into even the best of causes. And we're all human beings, so everybody can find fault with another human being. So we have to recognize that. They're not all saints. But basically, I think the murder of a very dear friend went to his heart, because he knew Rutilio Grande as a holy priest, a very fine person, as well as the people who were with him at the time, because he wasn't alone. So I think that's what did it. If they could massacre in cold blood a man like Rutilio, then I guess something set in. This is it. It's gone too far, and he began slowly to turn around, and then eventually, of course, his radio programs did not endear him to a lot of other people. So as the resistance built up, then he found the strength, and I'm sure he was guided by the Holy Spirit. So he just was open to that, and he gave himself completely. He drank the cup.
Thank you.
There was a question over here, a hand up over here somewhere. Who was it? In the back here, somebody had a hand up?
There's a hand up here.
Okay. All right.
Me? Okay,
Yes.
what are your suggestions for living up Monsignor Romero's vision and like in our diocese and for the city of Victoria? What are practical ways that we can continue this period?
I'm looking at them, the room's full of them. And I'm not joking. The answer to your question is in your own heart and the hearts of all the people here. I can't tell you what to do. I've suggested a few little things, and there's all kinds of literature on that, and you could read the life of Romero if you haven't read it already, and may be very helpful, and many books about him. But basically, inform yourself as best you can. Find other people. Don't be a loner, because if you're a loner, you're a lame duck. Because that's true. The forces of evil are highly sophisticated and very well organized. And people who stand up alone become a target, and you can be destroyed. And I know from experience. I've seen it happen. I've seen any number of people deeply involved in social justice go through the phenomenon we sometimes refer to as burnout. And the very most dedicated people will often burn out because they're taking on too much and they've allowed themselves to become targets. So get other friends to work with you, but start in your own backyard. Look around, see what's happening, and what can you do. Don't look for sensational things. Things will come as they, as they need to, eventually. But start now by doing little things like helping clean up in your own backyard. Good question, thank you.
Any more questions or comments? None over here? Okay, then, yes, Derek.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what
Given the Catholic Church's recent shift to work focusing on climate justice, if you could comment on what you think Oscar Romero's position would be on major fossil fuel expansion projects, BC and Kinder Morgan pipeline.
That position would not be different from that of other bishops in other climates. In that illustration, I'll give you one example from our neighbor across, because he was a Vatican Council Father and is a very dear friend of mine also, and that's Archbishop Hunthausen. Who at one time was first of all started as Bishop of Montana and then became the Archbishop of Seattle. And he let it be known publicly that he was not going to pay that part of his taxes which went into a war effort. And he paid the price and suffered for it. He's still living, by the way, although his health is broken down. But there's one example, and I take one from another country, rather than Canada, because I don't want to start naming my Canadian confreres. But there are a number of them who've gone out. Well, one case was mentioned earlier. The Canadian Bishops' Social Affairs Commission has over the years gotten involved in a number of major issues. So it's happening. You know, look around, it's there. Maybe not as ostentatious as some would like to have it, but there is. And particularly, you know, it's not just the bishops. Let's not identify the church with the bishop. The church is all of us, every one. We are all disciples, or called to be disciples of Jesus Christ. So let's all get at it, and we needn't compare ourselves to anyone else, but just do what you see right at this moment in the place where you find. What's the expression? Bloom where you're planted. Thanks for the question.
Yes, one more question, and then we'll have
I
a
would
closing song.
like to comment on this because, as Father said, the murder of Rutilio Grande was a turning point for them.
Which quote are you commenting on? Would you
I do
actually
not
read it out?
believe in death without resurrection. If they kill me, I will rise again in the people of El Salvador.
Yeah.
So, my father said that he was guided by the Holy Spirit because the murder of Rutilio Grande, instead of weakening his belief, you know, that's why he found his strength to continue fighting for social justice. And for the people of El Salvador, the murder of Monsignor Romero was a turning point. After that, we knew it, the hope, you know, any solution for a political negotiated solution to our struggle, it was over. So I like this quotation because, you know, we believe in it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and you spoke beautifully. Really appreciate that.
Thank you. And if I may, tomorrow we are having an event at 4 o'clock. It's 1379 Squamble Road at 4 o'clock. And it's going to be celebrated by Reverend Dimas Canjura from El Salvador. So all of you are invited. So we didn't want to miss this opportunity. And thank you.
Thank you.
Good, and let me add to the question you raised. You see, Oscar Romero said, I will rise in the midst of my people. When he said my people, that wasn't only El Salvador, because Vatican II said we are all the people of God. So Oscar Romero, assassinated, but now risen, and the Pope's going to do it officially by declaring him as a saint, canonizing him. And we are here. Oscar Romero is alive right here in this room.
And on that note, I would like to ask our two remaining musicians to come up and sing with us the final song.
There is a phrase at the end of the song that I would like song is called El Sombrero Azul. And the line is after I say, Dale Salvadoreño, you will have to say, Dale. Okay? All right. Easy.
Now, Alvaro, what does that mean?
It means, go for it. Go ahead.
Dale salvadoreño, dale, dale salvadoreño, dale. That one. I have no instrument now.
I have a terrible memory. I have to. El pueblo salvadoreño tiene el cielo por sombrero. Tan alta su dignidad en la búsqueda del tiempo en que florezca la tierra por lo que han ido cayendo. Y que venga la alegría a lavar el sufrimiento, en que venga la alegría a lavar el sufrimiento. Tal que la marcha es lenta, pero sigue siendo marcha. Dale que empujando el sol se acerca a la madrugada. Dale que la lucha tuya es pura como una muchacha. Vamos a entregar amor con el alma liberada. Grande salvadoreño, pero hay pájaro pequeño. El vuelo se detiene en su lugar. Dale salvadoreña, no hay pájaro pequeña. Después de alzar el vuelo se detiene en su lugar.
Al verte que yo le canto es el dolor de tus paisajes. Y no al verde de las colinas de matanzas tropicales. Las que fueron a Vietnam a quemar los arrozales. Hoy andan por estos lados con pueblar por sus torrales.
Dale salvadoreño, dale más pájaro pequeño, que después de alzar el vuelo se detiene en su lugar. Ay, dale salvadoreño, dale más pájaro pequeño, que después de alzar el vuelo se detiene en su lugar. Hermano salvadoreño, viva tu sombrero azul. Dale que tu limpia sangre reinara sobre el mar. Hicieron una enorme rosa de amor por la humanidad. Dale que salvadoreña por tu sombrero azul. Dale salvadoreño, dale pájaro pequeño, que después de alzar el vuelo se detiene en su lugar. Ay, dale salvadoreña, dale pájaro pequeña, dale después de alzar el vuelo se detiene en su lugar. Ay, dale salvadoreño, dale salvadoreña, dale salvadoreño, dale salvadoreña, dale salvadoreño, dale salvadoreña, dale salvadoreño, dale salvadoreña, dale.
Muchas gracias. Gracias por la vida. Gracias por todos. Hasta la vista. Buenas noches.
I'm like, it's a
The book is called Assassination of a Saint, and it's about the murder of Archbishop Romero. I wrote it because I was involved in the investigation of his murder and a legal case against one of the people responsible. So the book is all about the facts of what happened and the context of what happened in El Salvador, and about our investigation in the United States and in El Salvador against the killers, and trying to bring at least one and more, if possible, to justice. It's published through the University of California Press, and it's been out for about a year or so. Now with the anniversary coming around, and his canonization hopefully coming soon, I hope that it's a relevant book for people to learn even more about him and about his life, but also about unfortunately those who killed him and the situation that allowed that to happen. The book is available anywhere you buy books. The website, my website for the book is assassinationofasaint.com, and there are many ways you can order it there, or you can go to your local bookstore and ask them to order a copy as well.